The ship came down slowly through the amber clouds of Valtha Prime, and the whole planet seemed to hold its breath. The landing platform was made of pale stone that had stood for 3,000 years, carved with the names of every noble house that had ever bent its knee to the Velthri Emperor. It was a place that was meant to make visitors feel small. It worked on most people. Ethan Cole stepped off the ship and looked around without rushing. He was a man in his early 30s, average in height for a human, with dark hair cut short and a face that gave away very little. He wore the grey dress uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, no medals, no decorations, just clean lines and a single silver pin on the collar. In one hand he carried a sealed metal case. It was not large, but he carried it like it mattered. The air on Valtha Prime was thick and warm, and it smelled faintly of something like burnt copper. Ethan breathed it in once, adjusted to it, and then walked forward to meet the welcoming party. There was nothing welcoming about them. The Velthri were tall. The shortest one in the group stood nearly a full head above Ethan, and the tallest, a broad-shouldered lord in a long armoured robe with silver crests rising from the back of his skull, was closer to 7 feet. Their skin ranged from deep blue to pale green, and the crests on their heads shifted colour with their mood the way a human face might shift expression. Right now, most of the crests were showing a dull, amused gold, which Ethan's Neuralink told him translated roughly to entertained contempt. The Neuralink had been installed behind his left ear 3 weeks before departure. It translated Velthri speech in real time, directly into his understanding, with a half-second delay. It also translated tone. That part was not always pleasant. A court official stepped forward and read a long formal greeting in the old Velthri tongue. Ethan stood still and listened to the whole thing. When it was done, he responded in Velthri, not the simplified trade dialect that most human diplomats used, but the formal court register, clean and precise. The official blinked. A few of the nobles behind him exchanged a quick look. Then the moment passed and they moved on, as if it had not happened at all. The lord with the silver crests had not moved from his place. He stood slightly apart from the others with the ease of someone who had never in his life needed to push to the front of any room, because rooms had always cleared for him. His name, Ethan already knew, was Lord Kyrath Fosolon. His bloodline was 4,000 years old. He governed 2 star systems and commanded a fleet that could crack a moon. He was also, by every intelligence report Ethan had been given, the most influential voice in the Emperor's court. Kyrath looked at Ethan the way a man might look at something unexpected in his soup. He said something in Velthri to the noble beside him, not quietly. The Neuralink caught every word. He said, "Asterisk, look at the size of it. They really sent us this ... asterisk." The noble beside him made a sound that was the Velthri version of a laugh. Others nearby caught the exchange and their crests shimmered with that same dull gold. Ethan heard all of it. His expression did not change. He was led through the palace gates and into the grand entrance hall, and everything inside the hall was designed to be overwhelming. The ceiling was 200 feet high and covered in carved history. Wars won, species conquered, alliances sealed under Velthri terms. The floors were polished black stone that reflected everything above it like still water. Banners hung from iron rings the size of wagon wheels, each one bearing a noble house crest in colours that were too bright and too precise to be natural dye. The nobles who filled the hall watched Ethan walk through it. Some of them leaned toward each other and spoke. The Neuralink was busy. Asterisk, is that what they look like up close? Asterisk. Asterisk, no crest at all. Smooth-skulled. Like a juvenile ... asterisk. Asterisk, I heard they live less than a century. 1 century. Can you imagine ... asterisk. Asterisk, the Empress must have lost a wager ... asterisk. Ethan walked at an even pace, looking straight ahead, carrying the case. He did not look rattled. He did not look angry. He looked like a man walking through a room he had already mentally mapped before he arrived, which was, in fact, exactly what he was doing. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a wide dais of pale rose-coloured stone, sat Princess Seravel Onvelfar. She was the 3rd daughter of the Emperor, and she looked the part. Her crest was deep violet, the colour of the imperial bloodline, and it rose in clean, graceful arcs above her head. Her robe was dark blue and silver, and she sat with the kind of stillness that was not boredom but control. She was watching Ethan walk toward her with an expression that gave nothing away. Ethan stopped at the base of the dais at the correct distance, set the case down at his side, and bowed, not a shallow bow, but a full formal bow of the Velthri court, held for the correct number of seconds, released at the correct angle. He had studied this for 4 months. He executed it without a single error. There was a brief silence in the hall. Then Saravel inclined her head by exactly the degree that protocol required, no more, no less, and spoke her formal words of reception. Her voice was even and clear and carried without effort. Ethan replied in kind. Then he picked up his case and was led away by 2 attendants to his quarters on the east side of the palace. Behind him, the hall filled again with conversation. Lord Kyrath moved through the crowd with his hands folded behind his back, his crest shifting to a brighter, more comfortable gold now that the show was over. He told the Duchess walking beside him that the creature was smaller than he had expected. He told her it had learned a few pretty words in their language, the way a trained bird learns a few pretty sounds. He told her that this accord, this idea of a human groom in the imperial family, was an embarrassment the Emperor would eventually come to regret. The Duchess agreed with a thin smile. In his quarters, Ethan set the metal case on the low table beside the window. He sat down across from it and looked out at the amber sky of Vaeltha Prime as the last light of the day was pulling itself below the horizon. He heard everything Kyrath had said. He had heard all of it. He was not angry. He was patient. He had been patient his entire career, through things considerably worse than a tall alien noble with a bloodline and a sense of humor. He opened the case briefly, checked what was inside out of habit, then closed it again and lay down on the hard Velthry sleeping platform to get some rest. Tomorrow was going to be a long day, and Ethan Cole had never once wasted energy on the night before. The days that followed were not violent. That almost made them worse. No one raised a hand to Ethan Cole. No one threatened him directly. What they did instead was quieter and more deliberate, and anyone watching from the outside might not have noticed anything wrong at all. But Ethan noticed. He noticed everything. At the first formal banquet, he was seated at the far left end of the long table, below 3 lords whose titles were junior to his diplomatic rank. The seating chart in a Velthry court was not random. Every chair was a message. Ethan sat down in his assigned place without comment, poured his own water because no attendant moved to do it, and spent the evening listening to the conversations around him with the calm attention of someone memorizing a map. On the second day, his dietary requirements, filed formally with the court staff 6 weeks before his arrival, were forgotten. The kitchen sent up a platter of Velthry grain dishes, some of which were mildly toxic to human digestion. He did not eat any of them. He ate a ration bar from his travel bag and drank water and went to the evening reception without mentioning it to anyone. A junior Velthry aide found out later, went pale with what might have been embarrassment or alarm, and appeared at his door with a corrected meal and something that sounded almost like an apology. Ethan thanked him politely and ate. When he walked the grand halls, lords and ladies moved through doorways ahead of him without holding them open, without acknowledging him at all, as though he were part of the background. When he spoke at official functions, other voices simply rose over his, conversations pivoting away from whatever he had just said with the smooth, practiced ease of people who had been doing this to outsiders their entire lives. Lord Kyrath was always nearby when these things happened. Not always the one doing them, but nearby. Watching. Enjoying. On the 4th day, Kyrath made his move. It happened in the Hall of Conduct, a large circular room on the north side of the palace that the Velthry used for formal martial demonstrations. These demonstrations were a court tradition before any significant ceremony, including a marriage. A noble would show their war form, their skill with a blade or spear or weighted chain, as proof of the strength they brought to an alliance. It was not optional for the groom. It was expected. Kyrath stood in the middle of the hall with a wide audience around him and extended the invitation to Ethan in a voice that carried easily to every corner. He said it with a smile. He said that surely the human envoy would want to demonstrate the martial traditions of his people, as was proper. He said that the court was eager to see what humanity had to offer. He said it the way someone says a thing when they already know the answer is going to be embarrassing. Ethan accepted immediately. That was not the answer Kyrath had expected. His crest shifted, just briefly, just a flicker, before settling back to polished gold. He recovered smoothly and gestured to the arms master, a lean official named Dren Solus, to provide the human envoy with an appropriate weapon. What Solus handed Ethan was a practice staff, short, blunt, made of lightweight composite material. It was the weapon given to Velthry children in their first year of training. Every adult in the room knew exactly what it was. Some of them made no effort to hide that they found this funny. Their crests shimmered and danced. Ethan took the staff and turned it over in his hands once. Slowly. The way a carpenter might pick up a tool and silently note that it is the wrong size for the job, but decide not to say so just yet. He looked at Kyrath. He said, in clean Velthry, that he was ready whenever the Lord was. Karath's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes shifted. He announced that the demonstration would be scheduled for later in the week, citing court calendar pressures. He swept out of the hall with his usual gravity, and the audience followed him, and the moment dissolved into the general noise of court business. But the invitation was on record. Everyone had heard it. Everyone had seen the children's staff. That was the real point, not the fight, but the image. The human, handed a toy weapon, accepting it without complaint. That was the story Kyrath wanted circulating through the halls. Ethan set the practice staff down and walked back to his quarters. That evening, Princess Saravel came to his door. It was a brief visit. Protocol required it, a formal check-in, a few words, nothing personal. She had done the same on the previous 2 evenings, in and out in under 10 minutes. She clearly expected tonight to be the same. She knocked. He told her to come in. She stepped into the room and stopped. Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the floor. The metal case was open beside him on the low table. He was holding the blade that lived inside it, and he was running a sharpening stone along its edge with slow, careful strokes. He did not look up immediately. He finished the stroke, checked the edge in the light, and then looked at her. The blade was not Velthry. It was not like any weapon she had seen catalogued from human worlds. It was not long, shorter than a sword, longer than a knife, and it was made of dark grey metal with no decoration at all. No inlay, no carving, no housemark. It was completely plain, and it was sharp in a way that somehow registered as more serious than any ornamented warblade hanging in the palace halls. She asked what it was. He said it belonged to his grandfather, that the old man had carried it for 40 years and given it to Ethan when he was 19. She looked at the blade for a moment and then asked what it was for. Ethan looked up at her fully, direct eye contact, steady and unhurried. In Velthry culture, direct eye contact of that kind was something you offered to equals. Most beings dropped their gaze when they met hers. Every lord in the palace dropped their gaze. She had never once had a person hold her eyes that easily without it feeling like either challenge or performance. His did not feel like either. It felt like fact. He said the blade was for when something needed to end quickly and cleanly. She stood there for a moment with that answer sitting in the air between them. Then she completed her formal check-in, said the required words in the required order, and left. She walked back through the east corridor toward her own chambers and found that she was thinking about the way he had held the blade. Not for performance. Not to make an impression. Just the practiced ease of a man who had held that exact thing many times, in the same way, for a long time. And the way he had looked at her. Like he had already decided she was worth looking at properly, and was not going to pretend otherwise. She had been studying the human since he arrived. She had watched the court mock him and watched him absorb it without reaction. She had thought, at first, that it was diplomacy, that he was simply doing his job, swallowing the insults because the accord required it. Standing outside her door now, she was beginning to think it was something else entirely. That the patience was not the performance. That the stillness came from somewhere underneath the surface that the court had not seen yet, and had not thought to look for. She went inside. She sat down. She thought about it for a long time before she slept. In the east quarters, Ethan finished sharpening the blade, wrapped it carefully, and placed it back in the case. He closed the lid. He looked at the ceiling for a moment in the quiet. He had been in harder places than this. Much harder. And the thing about hard places was that they always looked the same from the outside, like you were losing. The trick was knowing the difference between losing and waiting. Ethan Cole was very good at waiting. Not everything in the Velthry court was about Ethan. He understood this, and it was one of the reasons he had stayed quiet and still through the first week. A man who watches carefully in a room full of powerful people will eventually stop seeing himself at the center of things and start seeing the actual shape of the room. And the shape of this room, Ethan had begun to understand, was not good. There were 2 factions inside the palace, and they did not like each other. The first was the Emperor's Traditional Council, old noble houses that supported the peace accord with humanity, not out of warmth, but because they were practical enough to see that a war with Earth would cost more than it would gain. The second faction was newer, louder in private and quieter in public, and it was led by a woman named Duchess Yara Phenol Siv. Ethan had noticed her on his first day. She was not the tallest noble in the room, and she was not the loudest. She wore grey and silver, not the bright war colours that lords like Kyrath favoured, and her crest stayed in controlled, neutral shades almost all the time. She watched things. She listened. She smiled at the right moments and said nothing when saying nothing was more useful than speaking. Ethan recognized the type immediately, because he had spent 12 years working around people exactly like her. They were never the most dangerous person in the room in an obvious way. They were the most dangerous person in the room in the only way that actually mattered. He had flagged her in a private message to the Terran Diplomatic Corps on his third night. He had noted her name, her position, her habit of standing just outside groups rather than inside them, and the fact that twice now he had seen junior lords leave conversations with her and then move quietly through the hall to speak with specific other people, like pieces being moved on a board. On the sixth day, things began to move faster. Ethan found out through Cal. Cal was a young Velthri, barely into adulthood, with a small pale crest and wide dark eyes that took in everything around him with the kind of nervous energy common to people who are always listening and never supposed to be. He worked in the East Wing as an attendant, changing linens, refilling water, carrying messages that people handed him without looking at him directly. He was, in the way of palace servants everywhere, effectively invisible to the nobles around him. He was not invisible to Ethan. On Cal's third visit to the East Quarters, Ethan had thanked him by name. Cal had stopped like he had walked into a wall. Ethan had asked him, in Velthri, carefully, without making it feel like an interrogation, how long he had worked in the palace. Cal had told him 3 years. Ethan had said that was a long time to learn the building, and Cal had looked at him with an expression that was half confusion and half something a little like gratitude. After that, Cal talked. Not much, not all at once, but in the careful small pieces of someone who had information and no one safe to give it to. On the 6th day, Cal came in to change the water on the window table and did not leave immediately. He stood near the door with his back straight and his eyes on the floor, and he told Ethan, quietly, that there was a session being called. An emergency session of the Noble Court, closed to outside observers. He said the session was about the Accord. He said he had heard things, pieces of things, words from conversations in hallways that he was not supposed to be listening to. He said the words he had heard were *forged report* and *Terran spy* and *remove the problem before morning*. Ethan was quiet for a moment after Cal finished. He asked Cal if he was sure about the last part. Cal nodded once, quickly, without looking up. Ethan thanked him. He told him to go complete his rounds and stay near the staff quarters for the rest of the night and not to come back to this wing until morning. Cal looked up at him then, just briefly, and whatever he saw in Ethan's face made him nod again, and then he left quickly and did not ask questions. Ethan sat down and thought through what he had just learned. Duchess Yara was moving on the Accord. That much he had expected, eventually. What he had not expected was the timeline. Emergency session meant tonight, which meant she had decided things were at a point where waiting was no longer useful. The forged intelligence was a clean play. Accuse the human envoy of being a spy, force the Emperor's Council onto the defensive, create enough doubt that the Accord stalled or collapsed entirely. Without the Accord, humanity's position at the Velthri table disappeared. Trade lanes, territorial protections, the fragile legal framework that kept colonial worlds in the outer system safe from being quietly absorbed, all of it rested on this one agreement, on this one marriage, on him standing in this room on this planet in one piece. The other part, remove the problem before morning was simpler and more direct. He opened the metal case. He took the blade out and placed it on the table. Then he took the small hard case beneath it, the one that looked like it held documents, and opened that too. Inside were 3 more tools, each in a fitted slot, each exactly where it was supposed to be. He checked them the way he had checked them 100 times before, in worse places, under worse circumstances. He was not nervous. Nervous was a thing that happened when you were surprised. Ethan had not been surprised by anything in a long time. He considered sending a message to the Terran Diplomatic Corps. He decided against it. Any communication from the palace was monitored, and if Yara's people were moving tonight, they were almost certainly watching the communication lines too. Anything he sent would confirm the spy narrative she had already planted. He thought about Seravel. He thought about the Emperor, a 10,000-year-old being who had agreed to this accord because he believed it was the right shape for the future. He thought about Cal, who had risked something real tonight to tell him what he had heard. He thought about all the people on Earth who did not know this room existed, this planet existed, this moment existed, but whose lives would quietly become harder if tonight went the wrong way. He placed the blade on the low table beside the door, within reach in under 1 second from a standing position. He turned the lights in the room down to half. He pulled the chair to face the door and sat in it. He folded his hands and waited. Outside, the amber night of Vaeltha Prime sat heavy and still over the palace. Somewhere in the north wing, the noble court was filing into a closed session room. And somewhere in the unmarked lower corridors, 3 figures in plain armor were being given an address and a time and told to be quiet about it. Ethan Cole breathed slowly in the half-dark and waited for the knock on the door that was never going to come. They were not going to knock. They came in through the service corridor at the back of the east wing, which told Ethan 2 things immediately. First, that someone had given them a map of the wing that showed the service access points. That meant someone inside the palace staff was working with them, which meant Yara's network was deeper than he had thought. Second, that they expected the east wing to be quiet and unguarded at this hour, which was true, because they did not know about Cal and did not know that Ethan had been given a warning. He heard them at the far end of the corridor. Not footsteps. Vaelthari armor was well made and the wearers were trained. What he heard was the slight difference in air pressure when a door at the end of a hall opens and closes. He felt it rather than heard it, the way anyone feels a room shift when something enters it. He had trained himself to notice this a long time ago, in places where noticing it was the difference between going home and not going home. He was already on his feet. Cal was not supposed to be in the wing. Ethan had told him to go. But when the door opened and a small pale shape pressed itself flat against the wall just inside the main entrance, Ethan understood that Cal had come back, probably because he had decided he could not just leave, and he had put himself right in the path of whatever was coming down the corridor. Ethan moved to the doorway of his room, blade in hand, and caught Cal's eye across the dark hall. He pointed at the corner behind the heavy decorative pillar near the entrance, low, covered, away from the line of movement. Cal understood immediately and pressed himself into it without making a sound. Good. The boy was smart. Then Ethan stepped back into his doorway and was still. The 3 figures came down the corridor in single file. They were moving fast and quiet, and their armor was unmarked. No house colors, no identifying insignia visible on the outer layer. They carried blades, not ranged weapons, which was practical at this range and also meant they wanted it to look like something other than what it was. The one in front was the largest, broad across the shoulders, crest flattened and covered with a tight hood. The other 2 were leaner and moved with the easy economy of people who had done this kind of work before. The first one reached his doorway. What happened next was not a fight in any sense that the Vaelthari court would have recognized. There was no call to arms, no formal positioning, no moment where both sides acknowledged the engagement. Ethan simply stepped into the corridor and did what he had been trained to do. The first attacker went down before he had fully registered that the doorway was no longer empty. Ethan moved inside the arc of the blade arm, took the weapon out of the equation with his left hand while his right used the blade in a short, controlled motion that put the first figure against the wall and kept him there, stunned and unable to get his legs under him. It was not a killing strike. It did not need to be. The second attacker reacted fast, faster than the first, which meant this was probably the actual experienced one, and the large figure in front had just been the opener. The second attacker's blade came across in a horizontal sweep that had a lot of force behind it and a good angle. Ethan stepped inside it, let it pass across his back by inches, and used the forward wall of the corridor as a geometry tool. He put his shoulder against it to change his angle, and that put the second attacker's momentum against him. There was a short, ugly exchange in the narrow space where neither of them had room to do anything graceful, and it was loud for a moment, and then the second attacker was on the floor and the blade was not in his hand. The third one stopped. It was a woman, Ethan could tell from the build and the way she had positioned herself through the approach, was standing 4 feet back and had not committed forward yet. She had a blade, and she had a ranged option in her offhand that she was deciding whether to use. She looked at what was on the floor. She looked at Ethan standing in the corridor, steady, breathing normally, not performing anything. Just standing there, in the half-dark, with the blade at his side. She lowered the ranged option. Ethan took that as a reasonable communication. He told her in plain Vaelthari to put the blade on the floor and sit against the wall, and she did. He used a length of the room's hanging cord to bind the 2 who were down, not comfortable, but secure. The third one stayed sitting against the wall and watched him with an expression that had moved well past the point of professional composure into something more honest. He asked her who had sent her. She did not answer. He crouched down in front of her and told her he was not going to hurt her, and that the only question now was whether she was going to be found here as part of a plot or as a person who decided at the last moment to cooperate. He said he was going to be in the Emperor's presence in a few hours, and he was going to explain all of this, and it would go considerably better for her if she helped him explain it accurately. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him where to look under the armor lining of the unconscious attacker to find the insignia. He looked. He found it. It was a small pin, no larger than a fingernail, in the shape of a 7-point house crest. He did not recognize the specific design, but the Neuralink cross-referenced it in 2 seconds and gave him a name that connected it clearly to Duchess Yara's extended household. Ethan pocketed the pin and went to find Cal. Cal was still behind the pillar, pressed into the corner so hard he might have been trying to become part of the stone. He looked up at Ethan with enormous eyes and the expression of someone who had just watched something he did not fully have the context to understand. Ethan asked him if he was hurt. Cal said no in a very small voice. Ethan told him to come. They walked together through the north corridor, past the outer palace guards who were, conspicuously, not posted in the usual numbers tonight, which told Ethan that Yara's reach into the palace staff was something the Emperor's security team was going to have a very long conversation about. He went directly to the entrance of the Emperor's private guard station, which sat at the base of the Imperial Tower. The guard at the door told him this was not a permitted hour for unscheduled access. Ethan placed the insignia pin on the desk in front of the guard. He told him, in formal Old Velthery, that there were 2 bound individuals in the East Wing service corridor who had entered the palace through an unmonitored door with weapons and intent, and that the pin on the desk would explain who sent them, and that the Noble Court's emergency session should probably be paused before it made decisions based on information that was about to be shown to be fabricated. He then placed Cal's hand on the desk beside his own and said that this witness had heard things he would be prepared to repeat in front of the Emperor's council. The guard looked at the pin. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Cal. Then he called for the Knight Commander. Down the hall, in the sealed session room of the Noble Court, Duchess Yara was making a very confident speech about human intelligence operations and the threat they posed to imperial sovereignty. She had not yet heard anything from the East Wing, which she had expected to hear from by now. She told herself it was a timing issue. She kept her crest neutral and her voice steady, and she kept talking. She did not know that the thing she had assumed was a soft mammal from a pale blue world was standing in front of the Emperor's guard with evidence in one hand and a witness beside him, and that the next hour was going to erase every piece of groundwork she had laid in the last 6 months. And in the corner of the guard station, Cole sat on a bench with his knees together and his hands in his lap, looking at Ethan with the expression of someone revising everything they thought they understood about something they had already seen clearly. By the time the sun came up over Valtha Prime, the palace was a different place. It did not look different. The pale stone halls were the same. The banners still hung from their iron rings. The polished floors still reflected the carved ceiling above them like dark water. But something in the air had changed, the way air changes in a room after a fire has been put out, still warm, still carrying the smell of what happened, but no longer dangerous in the same way. Duchess Yara Phenol SIV had been escorted from the session room before midnight. Her network inside the palace was already being pulled apart, thread by thread, by the Emperor's security teams. 3 household members had been detained. 2 more had gone missing into the city, which the guard teams were dealing with. The session itself, the emergency vote that was meant to dismantle the Accord and remove Ethan from the picture entirely, had been dissolved inside the first hour after the Knight Commander reached the session room door with the insignia pin in his hand. Lord Kyrath had been in the session room. He had listened to the whole thing, and he had not been part of it. The investigation confirmed this, and Ethan had said so clearly when asked. Kyrath had not been involved in Yara's plot. He had simply hated the Accord and used cruelty as his method of expressing that, which was a different kind of problem and not a criminal one. When the session ended and the truth of the evening became clear to the full court, Kyrath left the room without speaking. He stood alone in the corridor for a long moment with his silver crests gone flat and pale, which Ethan's Neuralink told him was the Velthery expression for something very close to shame. The Emperor received Ethan the next morning. The throne room was enormous and very quiet, which seemed intentional. There were a few members of the inner council along the walls, and 2 senior guards behind the throne, and that was all. The Emperor himself was ancient in a way that went beyond the simple fact of 10,000 years. He was not large, smaller than many of the nobles Ethan had met, and he sat in the throne with a stillness that made even the palace's stone feel restless by comparison. His crest was the deepest violet Ethan had ever seen, darker even than Seravel's, and it did not move. He studied Ethan for a long time without speaking. Then he said, in the formal old tongue of the Velthri, that when the accord had first been proposed, he had wondered whether humanity understood what they were asking to be part of. He said the Velthri had seen many species arrive at their gates with ambition and confidence, and very little else beneath it. He paused. He said he wondered less now. Ethan stood straight and met the Emperor's eyes and said that humans had been walking into rooms they were not supposed to survive for about 200,000 years, and that they were very stubborn about it. He said it respectfully, and simply, and without any performance behind it. The Emperor was quiet for a moment. Then something crossed his ancient face that might have been, in some way, the beginning of something like genuine regard. The inner council members along the wall exchanged looks. The accord was confirmed. Humanity's seat at the Velthri table was secured. Ethan bowed, the full formal bow of the court, and walked back down the long aisle of the throne room with the same even pace he had walked in with. In the days that followed, the court realigned. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen warmly. Noble houses that had centuries of survival behind them did not shift out of instinct or affection. They shifted because they were watching something and adjusting their understanding of what they were watching. Ethan was no longer the soft creature from the pale blue world, the charity pet, the smooth-skulled juvenile handed a children's toy at the sparring demonstration. He was something that had walked through a room they had designed to break him and had come out the other side with the evidence of a conspiracy in his pocket and a witness at his side, and had then stood in front of the Emperor and spoken like a man who had earned the floor. That was a language the Velthri understood. They had been speaking it for 4,000 years. Lord Kyrath found Ethan in the East Garden on the morning of the third day after the throne room meeting. The garden was wide and quiet, full of low amber-coloured plants that moved slightly in a warm breeze. Kyrath came alone, which in court culture was itself a kind of statement. He did not have attendants with him. He did not have the easy, contemptuous gold of his crests. He walked with his hands behind his back and stopped a respectful distance from Ethan and stood there for a moment as if deciding how to start. He said, without any of the performance Ethan had seen from him before, that he had a question. He said he wanted to understand how humans learned to fight the way they did. Ethan thought about it for a moment. He looked out at the amber plants in the garden and said that they had not so much learned it as they had never stopped practicing it. He said that humanity had been fighting something, weather, hunger, each other, everything else, for so long that the practice had become part of the species. That the calm was not an absence of readiness. It was readiness that had run long enough to look like calm. Kyrath was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ethan in a way that was different from every other look he had given him since the landing platform. There was no gold in it, no contempt, no amusement. There was something more basic and more honest, the recognition of a peer. He nodded once, slowly, and walked back through the garden without another word. But it was a different kind of silence than the ones that had come before. Saravel found Ethan that evening near the window of the East Gallery, a long room lined with tall glass that faced the open sky. She came without attendants too. She sat down across from him with the directness of someone who had decided that certain formalities were no longer serving any real purpose between them. She told him she had known from the first night, when she had come to his quarters and seen the blade and the way he held it, that the court had made a mistake about him. She said she had waited to see how long it would take everyone else to understand it. He asked her why she had not said anything, why she had not told the court what she had seen. She told him that in Velthri court politics, truth delivered too early is wasted. That truth only reshapes things when it arrives at the right moment, and the right moment is always later than it feels like it should be. She said she had learned this from her father, who had been saying it to her since she was a child. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said that his grandfather had told him something very similar about timing a cut. That you could have a perfect blade and perfect form and still miss everything if you moved before the moment was right. That the discipline was not in the arm. It was in the waiting. Saravel looked at him. She said she had not expected to find that she agreed with a human on matters of philosophy. Ethan said he had not expected to end up here at all, genuinely, and she heard the honesty in it. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not a court sound, not a performed thing, but something that came from somewhere genuinely surprised and genuinely pleased. In the Velthri court it was a rare sound, and Ethan thought it suited her considerably better than the controlled stillness she wore in public. The accord was signed 2 days later. The ceremony was long and formal and full of the old words and the old gestures that the Velthri used to mark things that were meant to last. The inner council signed it. The Emperor sealed it. Ethan signed for the Terran Diplomatic Corps in his clean, plain handwriting, using a pen he had brought from Earth because the Velthro version was too long for his grip. At the bottom of the last page, in a section that most of the council had skimmed past without reading closely, there was a small additional clause. Ethan read it slowly when the document came to him, and then read it again. It stated that all future human envoys arriving at Velthro Prime would be received with full peer honors from the moment of arrival.
No ceremony di las.
No seating below rank. No overlooked dietary requirements. The same standing, from the first step off the ship, that any Velthri noble of equivalent diplomatic rank would receive. Saravel had written it herself and placed it in the document without announcing it to the council. She had not asked permission. In a court where everything was about permission and hierarchy and the careful language of status, she had simply written what she thought was correct and put it where it belonged. Ethan folded the document and placed it into the metal case. He set it down on top of the blade that had lived there for 12 years, since the day his grandfather had handed it to him at 19 and told him that the world was harder than it looked, but that was not a reason to be harder than necessary. The case closed with the same soft click it always made. It had always carried a weapon. Now it carried something more. And Ethan Cole thought, with the quiet that lived inside him in the place where other people kept their pride, that his grandfather would have found that very fitting.